And it's very difficult in a modern society to function because you don't have rivers going the right directions. The winters are long and they're harsh. And so civilization in the way that we think of it is very expensive, and they don't have any natural ways to generate capital on their own. So it's always been a very brute force approach, and it took Stalin to industrialize what was then the Soviet Union. But that has a consequence. So Russia in 2 generations went from having 7 children per family to now under 2. And that was before the bottom fell out in the post-Soviet collapse. And they're now down to about 1.4. The generation that collapsed in the 1990s is now so small that when it's their turn to have kids, there's not a whole lot that can happen. So this is kind of the last year that the Russians have a large enough cadre of people in their 20s to have a draft-based military. You wait any longer than this, and the Russians are going to have difficulties patrolling their own internal territories, much less fighting off an external aggressor. So while no one's expecting a war in the short term of somebody invading Russia, the Russians know that if they don't do this now, that no matter what the power balances are in the future, they will always be on the losing side. But the Germans are no slacks. The Swedes always punch above their weight. The Poles have a historical grudge to bear. The Iranians and the Turks have never been Russian friends. The Chinese almost got in a nuclear war with the Japanese in the past, and the Russians are still smarting over their war with Tokyo back in 1905. So from the Russian point of view, there is no horizon that is safe. And the hypersonics just aren't the weapon systems to balance that. The only reason that the Russians have done hypersonics is their logic is if it works, then we have the ability to strike the North American continent in a very short period of time. I would argue, though, that what we've seen out of the Russian systems does not look all that promising for no other reason than either the Trump or the Biden administrations hasn't pushed for a new round of nuclear arms talks because as soon as they started working on hypersonics, we started working on hypersonics. And that was a program here that we shelved in the 70s. So it was very easy for us to get that back up and running again, whereas they were doing it from scratch. And if something is going to change the strategic balance that extremely, and the Russians know they can't keep up in the financial fight, you know they're going to be screaming for arms control because that's the only way they can achieve parity.
So hypersonics are what? Missiles that travel faster than the speed of sound? Is that what we're talking about?
As a rule, in most of the nomenclature, faster than Mach 5.
Okay.
So the idea is they have an intercontinental launch and then they glide down and then they're following the curvature of the Earth to the point that it's very difficult to track them. And so they make the entire trip to the United States in like 30 minutes or less.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say it sounds like pretty slow for a missile to go. What's the speed of sound? 700 miles an hour or something like that?
Yeah,
I don't know.
No,
yeah.
Loads faster than
Okay. That makes way more sense. Wow, 30 minutes from Russia to the U.S. that sounds like something that's really hard to shoot out of the sky or block. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about needing to fire your interceptor before you see the missile. That's the whole idea of it.
Wow.
Trust your instincts on that.
Yeah.
I have no doubt that there's some selective reporting, conscious or unconscious, going on. No argument on there. But the point is, Kharkiv is still there. Mariupol is still there. They've been under shelling for 20 days. There's been a dozen assaults on Kiev. All of them have been repulsed. But the real big one for me was that 40-mile-long convoy. It stalled a day in because it ran out of gas. And then 2 days later, the Russian troops abandoned it and walked back to Belarus because they ran out of food. That should not happen to the tip of your spear.
Yeah. To me, it looks like, and this is wild speculation, how do you not know that you don't have enough gas or food? I mean, you have to know going into it, or somebody does, but maybe that person was the person that sold the gas and the food and went, let's just play this one by ear, right?
There's a large history of corruption throughout the Russian system, the military included, but we thought, and when I say we, I mean everyone who's ever studied Russia in the last 30 years, we thought they learned all those lessons after Grozny. We thought they learned them after the Second Chechen War, because by the end of the Second Chechen War in 2001, they weren't doing this anymore. But here we are 20 years later, and despite a couple significant international deployments, and all of a sudden it feels like we're back in 1993.
Yeah, to me, it doesn't quite make sense. And there's a lot of different theories like, oh, well, they didn't really want to fight, so they're heading back. Or there's a lot of people that are ideologically opposed to this, so they're not going to fight, or they're self-sabotaging. But even if you've got a 40-mile convoy of vehicles, even if, let's say, a quarter of these people are self-sabotaging and don't want to fight, there's 75% of your forces is still left, which is already much larger than anything Ukraine could muster. What happened to them? Like, where did they go? Why did they go
Well,
back to
if
building?
the number is 25%, that's more than enough. Because if you're all advancing down a single highway, 3 or 4 vehicles blocking a convoy, everybody just has to stop. I mean, just the very approach to this is not a problem necessarily with just logistics. It shows a level of incompetence on strategic thinking. You're talking 1,000+ vehicles in a single file line, 40 miles long. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, that's idiotic. And here we are. So it's looking like a catastrophic failure to perform across the entire system.
I know that Russia has like a whole division of the army that's essentially like, I guess, a rail corps. What do you call it? Where they build tracks and it's temporary, but they build them fast. The whole point is they want to be able to run trains in because that's what they've been doing for 100 years is building trains so they can run in huge amounts of tanks. They don't have to drive them on a highway and run out of gas. What happened to
Right, but
those
you
folks?
have to secure the land first,
Right.
because if you
Okay.
get one stick of dynamite under one railroad tie and you set it off at the right moment, the train pileup that happens because of that is absolutely epic. So you only do that once you've actually pacified the countryside, and I would argue in the case of Ukraine, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, like ever. The
Yeah, I mean,
insurgency.
there's a certain degree of insurgency. I mean, let me back up.
Hmm.
The Russians are going to still win despite all of this. They outnumber the Ukrainians. They've got better equipment. They've got shorter supply lines. They don't have to worry about controlling their borders in order to keep the resources coming. They can suck up a huge amount of casualties, and Russian society will not rebel. Remember, it wasn't until you had almost 1 million dead in World War I that we had any inkling of political problems back in Russia. We're nowhere close to that. And a lot of Russians agree with what Putin is doing, either for nationalist reasons or for strategic reasons. So these reports that we do see about people fleeing Russia, they are true. There are dissidents. They are not going to win. So far, all of the protests combined, still talking less than 1/10 of 1% of the population. That doesn't move the needle in a dictatorship.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so Russia's going to win this. And then they're going to have to pacify the country. And the question is, what level of internal violence and sabotage are they willing to tolerate in order to move on to the next stage of the war? And that's where things get interesting from the NATO point of view.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
if there's one thing that was coloring American decision making on all things Russian, it's that they were maybe not a peer force, but a near peer force. And we would have to be very careful how we operated. We would have to be at the top of our game if we weren't going to have horrendous casualties. All of a sudden, that logic's gone out the window. And we now know that if American forces and Russian forces meet on the field of battle, the Russian forces will be obliterated. And if that happens, the only choice the Russians have is between a humiliating strategic withdrawal to do whatever the Americans say, or up the ante with nukes. And so from the White House, from the DoD's point of view, this has gotten a lot scarier than we ever thought it would be. Because all of a sudden, if we can't keep Russia locked down in Ukraine, if we can't bleed them there till they die, if we can't make it out of their reach so that they can then go on and do the next series of targets, then there will be a direct American-Russian confrontation that we can't avoid because these are NATO allies. So the NATO strategy, the White House strategy now, is to ship every piece of military equipment that we can that doesn't require a static physical resupply or launching point like a plane. So drones are good, anti-tank missiles are good, Stingers are good, anything like that's great. Send it all.